Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. We're going to take a slightly different track through endpoint malware protection today, and concentrate more on how the AI treatment of risk can actually pay dividends and benefits in to the organisations that deploy these types of measures. My name is Anton Grashion. I am Senior Director of Product and Marketing for EMEA here at Cylance. I've been with Cylance now for just over 2 years, so we tend to measure things in 2 years at Cylance, so I feel like a complete old-timer. As Lucy said, we'll be taking your questions at the end, so if you can either save them up, put them in the chat, we'll see how many we can get at the end of this. So start with a definition. So unprecedented. Everything that we tend to see these days in cybersecurity normally has unprecedented prefixed before it, without in previous instance, never known before, experienced, unexampled, or unparalleled. Unprecedented in terms of, and this is the standard slide in most cybersecurity presentations. We've got unprecedented growth in threat actors. We have unprecedented growth in cybercrime, growth in zero-day malware. We've got a skills shortage. Number of breaches is going up. This is from the Verizon DBIR report, for instance. So everything we see, everything we do when we get up in the morning, what CISOs are seeing day after day is an unprecedented rise and challenge to their organizations and to their risk profile in general. But what we really mean by that is the board has a lot of pressure on them for in terms of compliance and reducing risk to the organization while maintaining profitability and competitiveness. But it boils down to this quadrant. So you've got security on one axis, you have cost across the other axis. The board's perception of cybersecurity is that to get high security, you've got to spend a lot of money. So security is expensive, either in terms of manpower or in terms of just dollar value. The desire clearly is that we have high security at a lower cost. But unfortunately, the reality at the moment is that we have okay security, but at a relatively high cost. And part of the problem with that is everything is unprecedented apart from the tools that we're using to combat cyber crime, because that's actually relying on a precedent, on something having been seen. So we need to sort of resolve this dilemma for CISOs themselves. And if we can, then obviously we can actually provide major benefits to those companies and their risk profiles. So if we look at what analysts are recommending, so analysts recommend a platform approach. I think almost all of them, certainly IDC and Gartner, say that, so on the left-hand side of the slide, we can see the sort of old best-in-breed type approach. And that sort of says, so we've got individual layers, we've got individual vendors that are actually slotted in here. And what we've got there is this position where we have high security or perceived high security at high cost, because we have to maintain each one of these elements, and each one of the elements has its own associated CapEx and has its own associated OPEX with it. The platform approach, which if it was idealized, looks like the slide on the right, is that we can combine all those CapExes into this platform and also reduce the OPEXes because we have a single pane of glass that we can use to manage our security. And so the perception is that this platform approach is what we need to do in order to reduce risk. There's a couple of things wrong with this. One of them is that risk is the risk associated with running your security estate, not necessarily the risk to the larger business. And I think the two, while not mutually incompatible, they certainly work against each other at times. And depending on who you're talking to, whether you're talking to the security function itself, or you're talking higher up the food chain to the CFO or the CEO or even the CISO at times, you will get different perceptions on what sort of risk we're reducing with this approach. The other thing is that these platform savings can easily be negated, and this is sort of a bit of a cheap shot, and it's quite easy to say, because within your platform, because you're now not using best of breed, you're relying on overlap within the platform itself to actually make yourselves secure. Where if you miss something, you're hoping that the next layer is going to catch it. And also, if you look at something like the Deloitte report, which is sort of referenced on the right-hand side here, Deloitte report was about the beneath the surface of breaches. And in that report, they identified that 96% of the cost of a breach are in the implications of the breach, not in the cost to fixing the operational details, not in the cleanup, not in the forensics, in the business implications of that breach. So one of the dangers, and it's not just to a platform approach, it's to all cybersecurity. The danger is once you do have a breach, then your savings, your operational savings that you've been concentrating on, can easily be blown out of the water by the business implications of that breach. We can also look at this as a force multiplier. So we've got the 96% over on the right-hand side of the slide here from Deloitte, and Tomo also study that which showed that 84% of the assets of large organizations are intangible. So it's not in the things that you've got, it's in the goodwill in your stock price, it's in the goodwill of your suppliers and the rest of your supply chain. And so the middle diagram is actually a sort of, this is the sort of domino effect that happens when a breach first happens, and you end up with operational costs that you have to maintain. As I said before, you've got the cleanup, you've got the forensics, you've got escalation, because we now have to inform both regulators and end users and our shareholders. And then you've got the business implications at the bottom here. So if 96% of the cost of a breach are concentrated in the implications, and 84% of your company's assets are intangible, you've got a force multiplier in terms of risk that as soon as you've had a major breach, and we're probably talking about personally identifiable information here, once you've had that sort of breach, then you've got a multiplier of the concentration of the fact of where the cost is concentrated and where the assets of your company are located. So let's talk a little bit about risk. It's a risk for dummies. So I'm also a beekeeper in my spare time. And I also have a sensitivity to these things, which is not a great thing. So I have an EpiPen. However, is this acceptable risk? Well, yes, it is, because I enjoy beekeeping. I enjoy the concentration that it gives me and the connection to the real world as opposed to the world of cybersecurity. So I feel it's an acceptable risk, and I can carry my EpiPen. The consequences of failing to mitigate the risk. So one of the things I try to do is I try to avoid getting stung. And sometimes I'll double up my suit if my bees are in a particularly feisty mood. I'll double up my suit so that I don't get stung. Consequences to me of failing to mitigate that risk are very painful. I would have to self-inject the EpiPen, and I would probably also have to go to hospital as well, just to make sure that I was okay. And although this is a sort of a very personal example of risk and risk mitigation, applies across. This is what we're trying to do. We're trying to mitigate risk. In terms of breaches, the advice you never get is, first of all, don't have a breach. And that's flippant and fairly easy to say. But if you can reduce the likelihood of that to a diminishingly small number, the benefits to the organization are absolutely huge. And this is actually pulled out of the Deloitte study, and shows the cost benefit mitigation risk. So these are some of the implications of having that breach, and some of them are really obvious. You've got to pay for cybersecurity improvements. You've got the operational damage that you need to repair, but then the other ones are slightly more. You have to think about them a little bit more. The lost contract value in supply chain. So your suppliers might not trust you so much if you keep leaking or you keep having breaches. Your insurance premiums will obviously increase. Certainly your cyber insurance premiums will. There'll be an increased cost to raise debt, which is that's why the CFO is going to get involved in this. evaluation, stop price damage, and those are all relatively simple. So risk in terms for non-governance risk and compliance people, and this is a horrible oversimplification, but you will see a version of this chart. If you Google risk and risk chart, you'll see this in lots of places. What we tend to do is collapse probability and likelihood into a single probability. And so probability times impact equals your risk score. And we can then put those risk scores into a neat little diagram like this. And obviously things in red should get our attention first, and things in green is probably acceptable. Things in yellow and orange, then we need to make a call. Advantage of doing something like this is it allows us to compare risks from different parts of the business. So what's the risk that all my trucks break down, or there's a strike so I can't get petrol or diesel for the delivery trucks, and you can compare that against your cyber risk and weigh the two up against each other. Got a couple of complicators though, both of them birds, strangely enough. One is you can ignore the risk. Quote from Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel laureate, periods during which competition among experts and organizations create powerful forces that affect blindness to risk and uncertainty. What's that basically saying is we just need to compete. Is it going to happen to us? Well, we hope not. We've sort of put some measures in place. We'll be okay. And the other side is the black swan events. So black swan events are very, very rare events. So they would have a very low likelihood, but a disproportionately high impact. And the commonality between these two is unknowns. And unknowns is the unprecedented thing that artificial intelligence can help us address. And malware itself isn't a single risk, it's multiple risks. And until it detonates, you actually don't know which one of these it is, or which combination of these it is. Data exfiltration, credential loss, data destruction, resource appropriation, system downtime or dwell time. And we have to model each one of those maybe individually within the risk framework. Also, in insurance terms, end up with cascading or correlated failures. And these are very, very difficult to insure against, because if you have the breach and you have the malware infection, you can actually pass that on to your customers, suppliers, and partners. You can pass it on to their customers, suppliers, and partners, and you end up with this cascading or correlated failure. We can also over and underestimate elements of our risk equation in terms of probability, likelihood. We can due to warning fatigue. Too many security companies coming out and saying the sky is falling. Evidence is that the sky hasn't fallen on you yet. Therefore, you tend to be blind to some of that messaging. We can also overestimate the efficacy of our existing controls. You know, we're wishful thinking. We've spent a lot of money on this. We've taken a lot of advice, and so we think we're better than we are. In terms of impact, we've got the compliance multiplier, which we very early on. We've got an intangible asset multiplier, and we've also got this unknown detect and respond OPEX impact. So chasing problems into your network, i.e. not preventing them, has a knock-on effect, both in terms of your skill shortage and in terms of the time that you need to actually address that. The net of all this is that your risk is probably slightly higher than you're calculating anyway. AV, as we've said before, is based on precedents. It needs a patient zero. It needs something to be existing in order for it to be protected against. And you know, there's various debates over whether signatures are working, or whether we can use heuristics, which will soften that signature a little bit and help us. But in general, something happens and you have to react to it. And if we look at this simple example, so at time TV0, we have a new piece of malware that comes out, and until we have a patch or a signature issue for it, we've got a known vulnerability window. So that patch comes out, we're protected against that variant of malware, and your risk level drops out. The vertical axis on that diagram is risk. However, we all know that it's trivially easy now to make variants of malware, or to pack the malware so it looks like different malware, or just create new variants like this. It's very, very easy these days. And again, heuristics might help you cover some of these things. But in fact, you've got an unknown risk level, not only because it's easy to create new variants, but you actually don't know how long that malware has been in your network or in existence. This is when we first saw it. This is when it first became evident. That's not when it was first out. So you've also got an unknown vulnerability window which stretches into the past as well. And we see this time and time again when we do compromise assessments or incident containment exercises with our professional services arm. So I would posit that we need to predict block cyber attacks pre-execution on the endpoint in real time using artificial intelligence. This radically changes the economics of our cybersecurity practices. And we know that opinions on AI are slightly divided. The only utopian vision of AI I could find is Robbie the robot serving pancakes and maple syrup to someone in the 50s. And we have any number of examples of robots hunting people down in forests and becoming autonomous killing machines. That's Elon Musk actually not looking into a washing machine. That's his SpaceX rocket who's issued some dire warnings about AV. Or AI, or we think, oh, AI actually is not as good as we think it is. Look at a silly robot; it can't even walk along a street and climb a stair. However, Cylance AI augments human wisdom. My research is many years ago into artificial intelligence was about augmentation rather than replace human expertise. But AI can do things that people can't, or it does it in such a compressed time frame. It would make the human expert wouldn't be able to do it in that time frame, and therefore wouldn't be able to prevent malware happening. They might be able to dissect it over a couple of days or weeks and tell you what it was going to do, but by then it's probably too late. CylanceProtect, for instance, does not require signatures, and this is one of its fun strengths. We require a precedent, and I think that, especially in this unprecedented environment that we're living in, is especially important. And so what we take is a selection of malware, malware and non-malware, and we train our artificial intelligence model on that to determine what and we sometimes say the DNA of malware, which is almost wrong in every important aspect, but a great analogy of what the AI is actually doing. We extract features, and we extract over, I think, something north of 140 million features. Not from every file, but individually across the entire estate. That's what it looks like. And some of these features, you will understand they're human, understandable resource directory, debug directory, package use, etc. What DLLs it's using. We extract those features and we place that into the training set, and then we train, in essence, we're training a neural net to recognize what's good and what's bad. It's a simple classification. However, I mean, some of the features are non-human understandable. In fact, we use something called wave entropy, file entropy, and that file entropy is looking at the combinations of white space, encrypted space, and programmatic space within a file, and mapping that as a wave. And then you end up with a continuous variable feature, which probably wouldn't make any sense to you or I. But if you only use that single feature, and remember, we use over 100 million features, if you only use that single feature, you'd be around about 65% accurate in predicting whether something was malware or not. So it's a non-trivial thing to do. And so predictive prevention with AI, the nice thing about this is because we don't need a precedent, because we don't need a patient zero or a first infection, we can throw out a protection in front of us, almost into the future, if you like, because we can predict what this is. If it's malware or not, it will look like malware. And therefore, we can choose to block it, so we don't care how many variants are actually created at the click of someone's fingers. For the previous and existing malware that might be in the system, then you probably need a compromise assessment service. Actually, if you install CylanceProtect, it will go and trawl through all of your files anyway, and will find these. But I would strongly recommend a compromise assessment to make sure that everything is fine and that you get to a sort of threat zero type of approach. And the nice thing about the model is that we update that model every 6 months, and therefore we move that model on time and time again throughout the year. So twice a year update, as opposed to however often you have to update your signatures currently. Now, where this pays off in terms of your threat treatment dividend is if we can reduce the probability, then we get a benefit, right? So there are more things that you can do with risk, and there are probably more, but if we simplify things, you can accept it, which you can't really with malware. It's not an acceptable risk. You can avoid it. Again, you can't do this with malware because it's not something you choose to do. It's something that happens to you. So the only two things we can do is reduce or transfer. Now, transfer is normally we share that risk with somebody else, or we buy insurance. And so the best thing that we can do is reduce it. And the easiest thing to do, we can't change the impact of that sort of thing, but we can change the probability of becoming infected with malware if we can increase the efficacy of our tools. And so by doing that, move it down from the red maybe into the orange, which is the most that we can hope for. So in terms of AI and machine learning threat treatment dividend, we can reduce the probability by predicting and preventing malware-associated risks. That collapses the risk equation for the malware-associated risk to a diminishingly small number. The benefit that has then is that the risk, we've rendered the unknowns that are hidden from the risk equation, so we don't know what's happening when a new piece of malware comes out, what risks are associated with it, what damage it might cause, and so we've rendered those negligible. And what the net of all of this is the liberation of time and resources, which acts this time as a force multiplier in terms of benefits rather than in terms of risk or damage. And so that's it. Thank you very much for joining us. If you've got any questions, I think Lucy will be back on to field those.